Hola, hola, comunidad. We are in the month of June, which is also the season of Pride and mostly known all over the world. And we celebrate it for its movement towards the civil rights for the LGBTQ community. So, how do we know that it's Pride Month and that we celebrate it? Big brands have now come into the picture to bring the awareness, but now they are regressing on their support based on the pressure from the political right. Yes, there is a narrative from them based on fear, the fear of our communities being empowered by knowledge and, quite frankly, facts. But why June, you may say? Well, I'm going to give you a little historical perspective for some of us that may not know. Pride Month was originated out of the Stonewall riots in June of 1969. The Stonewall riots, also known as the Stonewall Uprising, the Stonewall Rebellion, or simply Stonewall, were a series of spontaneous violent demonstrations against a police raid that took place in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. The events at Stonewall created a revolutionary turning point that electrified and codified the LGBTQ plus movement, which was in step with many civil rights organizations, which further helped to serve and protect the LGBTQ plus community. It started political organizing, especially here in the Bay Area, where San Francisco elected the first openly gay politician, Harvey Milk, which created its own riots here after his assassination in 1978. Why do I bring these historical moments into today's podcast? It sheds light on how long the LGBTQ plus community has been fighting for their rights to be accepted, to just live in a society that brings in acceptance of self, of who we can be, and to finally be accepted for who we want to share our lives with and love. Today, we are facing a tremendous amount of fear mongering and hate towards the LGBTQ plus community in this critical election year. Also, with the setback of Roe versus Wade, and now the executive order to shut down asylum seekers at the border who are amongst the LGBTQ plus community looking for safety, we are now facing a humanitarian threat to the most vulnerable in our communities here in the United States. As more than 500 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have been filed across this nation, with the Midwest and the South leading the most bills being advanced into law, we can't ignore the ballot box this November. In the words of Marvin Gaye, what's going on? Tell me, what's going on? Welcome to Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom, where wisdom comes from everywhere. This is a podcast about generational wisdom shared to help build a bridge for future generations and to build stronger communities through education, technology, and health. Welcome to Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom. Today, my special guest is Mony Ruiz Velasco. She is a human rights advocate and attorney and the deputy director at Equality Illinois, where she works to advance a more equitable Illinois for all LGBTQ plus communities. She is a proud queer Latina mother and wife. For nearly 3 decades, Mony worked to advance immigrant justice, combining organizing, advocacy, and legal efforts. Before joining Equality Illinois, Mony was the Associate Director for Network Power for Alianza Americas, a transnational human rights organization. She was also an Executive Director of the West Suburban Action Project, where she advanced for local and statewide policy change. She provided legal services and organized local communities for systemic change. Mony also worked at the National Immigration Justice Center for nearly 13 years, where she became the legal director and provided legal counsel and representation to thousands of immigrants and their families, focusing on women, LGBTQ plus immigrants, survivors of crime, and other vulnerable populations. She advises and assists legislators and their staff regarding policy and legislation at the federal, state, and local levels. She believes it is just as important to show up in the streets, in the voting booth, and all other places of power. She currently serves as the board of the NIJC, the Chicago Latino Theater Alliance, and the Unitarian Universalist Advocacy Network of Illinois. Welcome, Mony. It is an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom. I am very honored to have you on the podcast today, especially in the month of June. As we were discussing earlier, how the month of June is Pride Month, known all over the world, and it's celebrated in most major cities, but also people like to join wherever they can, whether it's online or in online communities, or they create their own. I know small towns are actually getting more into Pride vibe because they feel that they can come out, or they want to show that they are there and they're being represented. And that's why I have you on the podcast today, because we're talking a lot about the issues that are coming up in the election, about the LGBTQ plus community, how they're really being taken, I want to say, under fire in a lot of initiatives through Congress. And I know it's very important for us to be educated about this community and the work that you're doing in Illinois through the Equality Illinois organization. And also, I just want to say, I love how I saw you and Anna celebrating Sunday Pride Brunch. It was an honorary lunch that you did. And Anna Deshawn, we say hello and celebrate you as well on this podcast. So welcome, Mony.
Oh, well, thank you again. I'm so excited to be here and be in this conversation. And, it's really important that we have these conversations and that we talk about LGBTQ communities, because the more we talk about it, the more likely that young people will find support within their families and other places. So I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but my hope always is that it'll be easier than it was for me for future generations. And current generations, not just future. But, I think that is always part of the motivation and the reason why I am so privileged really to do the work that I do. But, I grew up in Mexico. I grew up in South Texas, and really in a community where I didn't really have even the words, I think, to really truly identify myself, to kind of name the feelings I was having and to understand who I was in a more authentic way. And I come from a big family from a conservative part of Mexico. And even though my family is wonderful and very supportive now, it just, when you don't even have the language, I think it makes it very hard to find yourself, to create space, and to really imagine who you are and who you can be. And so I started out in college really studying literature. And I think that was one initial step for me to think about the wider world and the world in a different way than I had experienced it. I remember just reading lots of different books and lots of poetry and things about just other people's experiences, and with each of those steps really understanding the world in a different way. And then I went to law school in South Texas, and I became a lawyer, and I really started my career working with a lot of women who were survivors of violence and doing immigration work along the border. And then, later on here in Chicago. And, I think that opened the world for me in ways that were unimaginable. I was able to really work alongside amazing, resilient people who, had overcome barriers and hardship and violence, lots of difficult things to get to where they are. And I was able to, be a part of that journey and hopefully get onto a more healing path in their lives once we were able to work together to find some solutions to the challenges that we're facing. And through that process, I had children when I was younger, in my 20s. I started out kind of young and I was formerly married to a man, again, without understanding like really who I was. And I think, at some point, I thought, huh, this is interesting. Like some of these things I'm feeling and I don't know what they are. And I don't know other people who identify as a lesbian or who have, were in like, I didn't know growing up, like other women who were in relationships with each other. And it really took me a long time, I think, to break through a lot of those barriers culturally, religion. I mean, there's just like so many layers of oppression, really, that I think we all kind of grew up with, and or many of us do. And it wasn't until I was a little bit older when I finally was able to come out and to really live authentically as myself. And I always like to tell people that it was like when if you have the experience of not seeing very well and wearing glasses, when you're able really be yourself and live authentically and like love who you love. It's like the first time you wear glasses and you're like, oh my gosh, everything is clear and crisp and right. And, life is just shines in a different way. And that was my experience. That's how it was for me. And we all have a different process and a different path and a different journey. And, hopefully the work that I get to do now, which is advancing justice for LGBTQ people and, also trying to be visible in Latinx spaces and, supporting people who are coming up through in their own journeys.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about that in depth, and it's because I wanted to understand, or I had questions about religion in that aspect, because we talked about the history and a lot of the foundational kind of parameters that are put, especially in our culture, right? And a lot of us, are brought up. But I think today, a lot of folks feel that they're able to come out. And in fact, that is probably why a lot of these bands are coming out. And it's really just, I think it's all based on the previous work that has been happening over the decades, through the Stonewall riots and how organizations came together through the different HIV and AIDS epidemics that were happening in these metropolitan areas, and how people came together to support each other and to love and support and be who they want to be. And I just want to bring folks up to speed is that there's so much pressure and there's so much of a time that this fear-based mongering of your identity, and it creates a fear narrative out there. And that's what I want to get into, because this is what's happening today across the nation, and especially in communities of color. I think it's even more important because we're still, especially in the South. I was looking at a map here from the Williams Institute that you highlighted to me, that all the bills and that are coming through, especially in Florida, Arizona, Louisiana, Mississippi. I mean, it is unbelievable. And it says here 11% of all Latine in the US identify as LGBTQ. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the numbers here, that why it's important to recognize this? Because it's not, it's in major cities, it's all over the United States.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to remember is there are LGBTQ people in every corner of this world and in every corner of this country, in every community, no matter how urban or rural or somewhere in between. We are everywhere, in every community, in every family, like everywhere. And so it's not just like an issue in one place or an issue in another where we have to talk about it here or there. We just need to have these conversations and really be able to talk about all of these issues. And even though there's been huge progress, right? Like obviously, we're able to have this conversation that wouldn't have been able to maybe happen years ago, right? Even though more and more young people are identifying as LGBTQ, the majority of young people still don't feel supported and safe at home. And so even with all of the progress that we have made, we still have a long way to go, because even though we've been able to change the laws to include more protection, we still haven't advanced enough where people feel safe and are able to live and thrive and be happy in, no matter where they live. So it's not that the LGBTQ community is growing, is that more people feel safe identifying as LGBTQ than ever have. And particularly younger people, more than 20% of young people, and particularly Latina young people, identify as LGBTQ. So that's 1 out of 5, So if you just look around your home, look around your kids' friends and schools, it's 1 out of 5 kids identify as LGBTQ. And that means that we need to make sure that they have the support and the infrastructure that they need to be able to grow up supported and loved and, so that they can live authentic lives, because you can't truly be at peace and happy and thriving unless you can really live authentically as yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you have here in the stats, and we're going to put the link in the show notes from the Williams Institute. Is nearly 70% of LGBTQ Latina adults have experienced verbal assault and abuse. 42% have experienced physical violence or threats. And then 43% of all Latina youth seriously consider suicide, and 18% actually attempt it, higher than the general population of the LGBT youth, which is 39 to.
Yeah, the general population, 39% of the general LGBTQ youth population has seriously considered suicide, but it's 43% for Latina youth. So it's higher for Latina youth, and it's also higher for where they have attempted suicide is 18%. For the general LGBTQ youth population is only 12%. Not only, it's too many. One is too many.
Oh, absolutely. And I was reading another statistic that a lot of homelessness is due to domestic violence of people that are also in this LGBTQ community, and trans women, right, are murdered at a higher rate that nobody talks about. And I just get so upset about that nobody except Anna Deshawn, when she brings it up, and other folks, and Anna and I have talked about this on the podcast, is that we need to really recognize the seriousness of this, the threat of violence against, folks that want to just, be themselves, and also the community and how they need to be supported. So there's a lack of services. And this is where I love the work that you're doing, Mony. And it's like, hey, people want to have a little respect and identification showing up, and people are very resistant to that. So do you want to tell us, why do we use pronouns rather than the gender, like Mrs. or Miss? Can you tell us about that? Because I'm sure people bring that up at times.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think one of the things, for us that's important is that, we want to make sure, especially when we are out in the community or doing presentations or whatever, we want to make sure people feel comfortable asking us questions and feeling like they can, say like, well, why should we have to do that? Or why do we do that? And I think, one of the things about pronouns is that it's just a way to really show inclusion and respect, right? So we all are called different things, sometimes by our family, sometimes by our loved ones, sometimes by our friends. And it is kind of just like that, right? This is how I identify. This is who I am. And I think being able to ask someone, what are your pronouns? Or for you to identify yourself, like if you're in a group or in a meeting and saying, these are my pronouns, it is again a way to show that you are open to someone's identity and you are including them, and you want to make sure that they are seen for who they are and how they identify. I always like to tell people it doesn't take anything away from you or how you identify. You can identify how you identify. And the idea is that you just create space and you show your love and care for that person by identifying them with the pronouns that best reflect their identity.
Yeah. And it's the same with, and I'll bring this up, to our community of, they say Latinx or Latine or Hispanic or Latinos. And it's like, everybody still gets in this debate about, we don't go by Latinx, we go by Latine, or we go by Hispanic. Can you expand upon that too? Because I want the community to understand that we're here to bring people together and to educate, to understand where we can bridge better conversations. And this is why I have you on the show, and why we're talking about these things, because I hear these things in conversations sometimes. And it's really, I want to get to the, like, we're all a part of this community, but why is it that people want this? I guess it's like a label, but you just said it's to be inclusive, it's to create space, it's to create welcomeness. But the Latine, Latinx, that discussion has always been kind of tossed around a little bit.
Yeah, well, and we know that like Spanish language is gendered, right? It's a binary language for the most part. And we use, a lot of our words are either male or female. And obviously, there has been an evolution in our society, in our culture that has happened over many years. There are many indigenous native cultures that have people that they have like really venerated and respected and elevated that are two spirit people. And two spirit people are basically, not basically, they are part of the LGBTQ community. They are people who don't necessarily identify with one or the other, if you look at it in binary gender. And so I think our language, just like with many other words, language, it's organic and it evolves, right? For the same reason we're not speaking Old English like they were during Beowulf's time, during like the Renaissance and before. Language changes. It just does. It changes with culture and it changes with immigration. It changes for lots of different reasons, right? And so this one more change. It's not anything that hasn't happened before. It is just part of the natural evolution of language that changes with society and culture. And gendered language excludes people. So, in Spanish, as you may know, like if there's one single male in the room, everybody's gendered as male, right? So, and that leaves me out. It leaves you out. It leaves all the women out, right? And so there is a way to make language gender neutral so that it basically is inclusive of everyone. And I know that sometimes people are resistant to change because they say this is the way it's always been. But there's a lot of things we've changed about society that aren't the way they've always been, right? Like we have careers as women. We are not, all, staying at home and not have, we can vote. There's lots of different things that have happened and that are changing and that will continue to change even beyond what we can imagine today. So having gender neutral language, which again goes to the Latinx, Latine, is one more evolution. And just a little bit of context that on Latinx and Latine and the difference between those two. I think they're both attempts to be inclusive and attempts to, take away the gender binary that exists in the Spanish language and in many other languages. And the Latinx term came from a group of scholars and activists here in the US who were trying to make the language more inclusive. And in Spanish, when you're speaking Spanish, having an X sound at the end of a word is a very hard way. It's not like a natural, organic way to pronounce a word. So for the most part, I think Latin America has really adopted the use of the E at the end of words rather than the O or the A, which has been the kind of gender binary language to be inclusive of everyone. So Latine is a non-gendered way of saying Latino, Latina, Latines. Everybody is included with an E at the end, and you don't have to exclude anyone else or make a judgment, right, about someone's gender identity because you don't always know based on how someone looks what their gender identity may or may not be. So using Latine is also a way to be inclusive just of everyone without having to be specific one way or another and recognizing that not everyone lives in that binary of male and female, but there's a lot in between there.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you for that, because I'd like to go back to the beginning of what you said that started you on your journey of being a lawyer, going into law school, and that was reading books. You had this affinity for reading poetry, and you love to read books. And right now, I feel also there is a renaissance of people wanting to publish more books. There's a lot of our communities that are publishing books and telling our stories. And that's a great way to get a lot of our narrative out and published. But in Texas and Florida and other states in that map that we'll have in the notes, there's so many book bans that are coming out. Can we talk about that, please? Because that is like amongst these other things, because it's really geared towards the youth. Towards education. Like, this is a serious war on the youth of the LGBTQ community, before they even have a chance to really be themselves, right?
Yeah. I mean, books, I always think like books saved my life. Books, I was able to understand the world, understand myself. I mean, they still do every day. I feel like I love to read. And so I think that is always a way into understanding the world from somebody else's perspective. So, yeah, I mean, I think book bans have been an initiative. And, many of these have started at very local, like school board levels. That's why it's super important to be involved. I know we'll talk a little bit about that later on, but to be involved at every level, right? Not just like at the highest level, but your community and your schools, things like that, to really, like you said, keep kids and keep young people in the dark and to really limit their understanding and their resources that are many times life-saving resources. And one of the things that we know is, kids are super savvy, right? Kids will find a way, one way or another, sooner or later. But we know that the sooner or later causes a lot of harm if it's later than sooner, right? We know that along the way, that's why we have high numbers of kids who, don't always have access to important resources and understanding of many different things, right? Or if you have book bans, as we have seen in some places that don't allow kids to talk about different variations of families, then kids aren't always able to come in fully as themselves into these spaces. So even if they themselves are not LGBT, maybe they have two moms or two dads, and just if they're not able to explore that and see themselves reflected in literature and in other stories, it's very hard to see what your place is in society as you're growing up. And so, I think these book bans have been a way to keep, like I said, people in the dark, to create also shame and oppression. And I think, one of the things that's important to remember is, I know we're talking about LGBTQ communities, but, the majority of book bans and these issues have not been only about LGBTQ, but they've also been about race and ethnicity. And so I think this is how these larger systems really try to keep our communities in all of our different identities, oppressed and without access to power and access resources. So, this is not something that is exclusive to LGBTQ. It's also, you know, like not being able to have books in Spanish or not being able to have books that reflect Latina identities or Latina families. And we know that, seeing ourselves reflected in that is how we help make sense of the world and of other things that are happening around us.
Yeah. So, you talk about these bills, and there's literally a big war that's happening that we need to tune into. And so, this is where I'm getting to, is the voting, because voting matters. And the majority of voters that show up to the polls are really going to have a lot of these issues on their ballots. Am I correct, Mony, in stating that? Is that?
Yeah. And whether it's directly or indirectly, right? Because voters need to understand where those candidates stand on all of these issues. And I wanted to mention one other thing just about, all of these attacks against LGBT people are creating people who are having to flee their home states to get access to affirming healthcare and to other support services for their young people and for themselves. And the UN has said that in the US, and they're estimated that over the next year, there will be at least 1 million internally displaced people within the US because of these like terrible laws that are going into effect all around the country. And, it's not just in the South. I mean, the South has been kind of where a lot of it has solidified. But here in Illinois, we're in the Midwest, and almost every state around us has banned affirming healthcare and other kinds of reproductive health care. And we are having, thousands and thousands of people come to Illinois for support and services from all over the country, not just from the Midwest. So this is something that's going to impact, or that is impacting people all across this country. And for the same reason, it is why voting matters, right? Because these attacks are happening because legislators, those states who were voted in, into their roles are passing these terrible laws that are really harming people. And we need to make sure they're voted out of office.
Right. And so, what would you suggest for people to start, looking or getting ready for this voting year around these issues?
Yeah. I mean, there are similar organizations to ours. We're in Illinois, we're Equality Illinois, and we work at the state and local level. And there are equality organizations in almost every state across the country that are similar to ours. So no matter where you live, there's an Equality California, there's an Oregon organization, there is like New Mexico. So they are doing really important work all across the state. And those organizations will all have information about just their candidates and supporting, who they're supporting. Those organizations will have similar information. And then I think there's some national organizations. There's the Human Rights Campaign, and I can send you the link to their website as well. But they will also have information on some of the national kind of trends that are happening and information for people about national candidates. So there are also resources there. And I think it is just important to understand, given all the things we were talking about, right? Like access to resources at schools, like book bans, access to healthcare for people, just the violence that LGBTQ people are experiencing. All of those things they work across issue, but also across communities, right? Because we know that there is, for example, a high level of violence and threats against LGBTQ people, but that's going to be higher in communities of color, right? And I think, again, that's why we need to all care about all of these different issues. The same goes for pick an issue like the environment or economic justice. All of those things are areas where LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted by all the harm that comes from all of these different areas. And when you layer that for Latinx people or Black folks, all of that is going to increase the level of harm. And so we need to make sure and ask those hard questions of our candidates if you can and have access to do that. And if not, we have to just read up on them and make sure that we understand, what kinds of positions they're standing for.
Or run yourself in the community, become that leader. And we talked about this in my prior episode with Marlene Sanchez, who and we talked about community leaders. But, the other thing I want to touch upon, which is related to the statistics of violence that happens to the community, it's mostly impacted towards moving them into the incarceration criminal justice system, and it starts at a very young level. And women at this current moment are the highest incarcerated across the United States. And then you look at LGBTQ people, they're 3 times more likely to be incarcerated. And then how that affects everybody in the system, from the families to the jails to the juvenile justice system. It's like we're talking about the issues that stem to get it almost seems like it puts them there. Everything that's happening, it's like, where do they go? And this is the wrong way. This is the wrong way. I mean, this is my opinion just based on all the facts in my last episode with Marlene, talking about the incarceration of our community, just being, longer sentences. And the juvenile justice system is really just impacted by the lack of resources. I mean, this is all we're talking about right here, correct?
Yeah, no, that's right. And, 20% of youth in the juvenile justice system identify as LGBTQ. And we know that oftentimes many LGBTQ youth are kicked out of their homes, for example, when they come out or identify or their parents find out that they are LGBTQ. And that leads to many other challenges with them, right? If they're living in the street, if they don't have support, if they don't have something to eat, if they're like crimes related to poverty and survival, right? That sometimes people are forced into these difficult positions. And the same thing, we as LGBTQ people are overly represented in the criminal justice system. Like you said, we're 3 times more likely to be incarcerated, 6 times more likely to be stopped by the police than our straight cisgender counterparts. And that creates obviously, additional harm when also we know that criminal justice system is not designed to be inclusive and restorative, right? It's really about punishment. And it's, oftentimes the conditions in the jails and the detention centers are terrible and harmful, and people suffer even more harm when they are in those systems. So absolutely, I think we need to make sure people have access to resources and have support and have access to affirming health care, so that if people have mental health challenges or any other challenges, they're able to get the support they need and not end up in the criminal justice system where they're going to be harmed further.
Yeah, I mean, I know it sounds a little gloomy here, but it's like this is what we're talking about as far as things that are going to be impacting the ballot box this coming election, November. And what I want to start to talk about is solutions and wins, because the Equality Illinois and what Mony does there with her team, there are wins across the board and how they celebrate community. And so, Mony, can you talk to us about some of those wins in policy making and breaking down some of these barriers that have helped community, and where we can all support, like in this next few months, like what besides voting, like I think we've talked about it, but let's hear some of the wins, and let's hear some activation points that we can get involved in.
Yeah, for sure. And the LGBTQ community is a beautiful community. It's beautiful. It's vibrant. It's colorful. It's I don't know. I have obviously so many different ways to describe our beautiful, resilient community, right? Of LGBTQ people, our chosen family, right? We often have to take care of each other when our families don't always take care of us, and so our community is a strong community, and we are doing a lot of really great work. And it's, even though we've heard about all of these hard things that are happening in the states around us, there are many other states like Illinois, like California, that are Oregon, like many of the states, New Mexico, that are passing really important laws that continue to advance LGBTQ justice and equality. And, we've been able, for example, here in Illinois, and I think California has done something similar, where we passed a bill to require that LGBT history be taught in schools, right? Because, like I said, when we see ourselves reflected in the stories that we read and the history that we read, we can understand the world in a different way. We can see the path to our own selves in a way that you can't always do that, right? If you don't see yourself reflected. And I think it's similar as Latina people, right? If we don't hear about our ancestors of the past and the people who have done amazing things and broken barriers, so that you and I can sit here and have this conversation, it is, harder for us to be able to navigate the world without those leaders who came before us. And so it's important to recognize that work that was done. So that is an example of something that has been, very meaningful, because schools across Illinois are teaching LGBTQ history, and young LGBTQ kids are able to see themselves in that history. We've also passed bills to make it easier for people to change their name, so that their identity documents match their true identity. And that makes a huge difference in people's lives, and primarily trans and non-binary folks who, feel extremely stressed if they can't do that, right? If you have to, every time you show your ID to get on an airplane or to get into a bar or to check into a hotel, an ID that doesn't match what you look like, that is really, really traumatizing and difficult. And so having the ability to change our documents to reflect our identity is, again, another really important advancement that we've been able to make, and that, really changes people's lives on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that the states that are setting the pace, it will reverberate across to other states, and also folks will come over here. So, I mean, there's resources, and I know they can go to your website and find those, and also here in California. But for those that are in the states that don't have the resources, please reach out to our information sources and we can definitely get you pointed in the right direction. June is an awesome month. Again, it's Pride Month, and I love June also because it's my birthday, but I love to go to Pride celebrations. They are the best. So I'm just reflecting on the community. It's been in my family for a long time. I've been a part of, I hate to say it, but a few of the movements that here in San Francisco that have been really, I want to say, impactful to me, really supporting, the LGBTQ community in any way, shape, form I can do. And I love that you're on the podcast, Mony, and that we've connected. And so I want to just leave folks with something that you think will really elevate, you know, like an activation for folks that are listening, because this podcast goes out across the nation. It's even global, and people are always wondering, like, where is it that the United States, or not even the United States, but the LGBTQ community is really kind of bringing a North Star to folks? Like, what would that be?
Oh, well, that's a hard question. And I'm not sure that I have a good answer, to be perfectly honest, about how the US is, particularly with what we saw earlier today. We saw the president issue an executive order closing the border, which actually, again, disproportionately impacts LGBTQ migrants and LGBTQ asylum seekers, many of whom are coming here to seek protection from persecution and harm that they suffer in their home countries. And with the regression that we're seeing of our laws, I think, though, that one of the things we often talk about is, as LGBTQ people, it's not a community that we're born into, right? So it's not like when you have your family and your family all kind of looks alike and, or has similar cultural identity, even if you don't all look alike, we all look different. But or if you grow up in a Latinx school, maybe you have a lot of folks around you or teachers or other leaders. With LGBTQ folks, we're not born into like an all LGBTQ community, right? And so we have to find our communities. And so the spaces that we create for ourselves and the spaces that our allies and the people who are supporting us help create with us are super important and beautiful. And that's why it's important to celebrate Pride season, not just Pride month. And also to be aware like all year, right? Because we're here all year and we want to make sure that we are engaging with people. There are, like I said, there are local organizations in every state that can always use supporters, that can always use donations. So I encourage everyone to look in their own state at their equality pro LGBT organizations. And also there are important groups like at the national level, we have the Trevor Project is an organization that gives mental health support to youth, to LGBTQ youth. They're a super important organization. That's another way to engage. And then just get involved locally, get involved in your local schools, go ask questions of your principals and superintendents about the things that they are doing to be extra supportive of LGBTQ people, to make sure that they have reading materials and are teaching LGBTQ history, so that making sure that the kids are getting the support that they need in school.
Yeah, I love all of that, Mony. So thank you for that. And where can we find you online? And is there anything special that you're doing for the summer? Like, leave us with a little, fun news. I know this is summertime, so let's see what your summertime fun is.
Yeah, well, we're summertime, and June in particular is our busiest month, as you can imagine. And like I said earlier in the start, there's more and more Pride events happening all across the country. And here in Illinois, we have more than 30 Pride events happening this month alone. So, I will be traveling across the state of Illinois, going to a lot of those Pride events because especially, obviously here in Chicago, there are some big celebrations. We have our big Pride Parade. It's one of the biggest ones in the country. And it was the first one after the Stonewall riots that took place. And we have over 1 million people who come to our Pride Parade every year. But, there's like Pride, like this weekend, I'm going to Ottawa, Illinois, which is about 2 hours away from Chicago. And this is their third Pride celebration that they've ever had. And it's so beautiful to see families and young people and older people of all ages coming together to celebrate Pride, to celebrate the people that they love. And it's a beautiful time of year for all of that.
It's the dancing that does it for me. I want to do, and this is a future seeding, opportunity. I want to do a podcast on music that started the movement as well, because, back in the 70s, the disco and, the community, it's all tied together. And I mean, that's my belief. I don't know, but I'm going to do some history on that and see if that's, true, but it's the dancing for me.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, there's lots of fun dancing that usually happens at every Pride event. So there'll be lots to choose from.
Right, right. Well, I hope to see you soon, Mony. Thank you for joining me today on Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom, and we'll have all your information in the show notes. And yeah, everybody, let's have a great summer and get the vote out in November, and look for us online with all the information that you need from the Equality Illinois and also from the Equality California. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mony, for joining us today on Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom. Gente, it is so important for us to show up this election year. This is a critical moment for all of us to stand in power. I will have links in the show notes for where you can find the information we referenced to the bills in the states that are working to weaponize our freedoms, our civil rights against comunidad. We are grateful to have Mony on this podcast today to really be a source of truth, and also in her expertise to tell us of these incidents and crimes and wins for our policymaking as we come together in a state that can be unified through community power. Again, thank you for joining me today on Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom, Mony. If you'd like to get in touch with Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom, please reach out to us at info@latinasb2b.com. This podcast was produced by Teresa E. Gonzalez and co-produced and engineered by Robert Lopez of Crates Audio, and sponsored by 5E Leadership and Marketing. Gracias.